Well, let's move on now. Let's talk about the lead-based paint disclosure. Of course, this is something that we're all familiar with. We've worked with the lead-based paint disclosure for a long time. And in the contract to buy and sell in section 10.10, it talks about the lead-based paint disclosure. It says in there that this contract is void meaning no force in effect, not a valid contract, it's just void. It doesn't even exist. That the contract is void unless, one, a completed lead-based paint disclosure sales form is signed by the seller, the required real estate licensees, and the buyer. And here's the big one. Number two, the seller receives the completed and fully executed form prior to the time when the contract is signed by all parties. So it has to be signed by the buyer and got back to the seller before the rest of the contract is signed and before the seller receives the rest of the contract. Now, ultimately, the objective here is that the buyer needs the opportunity to solidify his or her offer based on the knowledge of what's on the lead-based paint disclosure. That information that is given to them on the disclosure by the seller is pretty critical, and they need to have it prior to submitting their offer. So let's look at a quick practical scenario here. In this case, the listing broker lists a home built in 1942. And obviously, since we are required to give a lead-based paint disclosure for any property that has a building permit issued before January 1st of 1978, this property qualifies for the need of a lead-based paint disclosure. So the listing broker discloses the possible lead-based paint to a buyer's broker, but doesn't provide a signed lead-based paint disclosure. And at closing, the listing broker provides the buyer with the signed lead-based paint disclosure, but the buyer says, not doing it, not going to close, because the buyer is claiming the contract is void. Now, was the contract void? Yes, according to the terms of the contract to buy and sell, it's void. Does the buyer have the right to do that? Well, that's going to really be up to a court to determine whether they can do that. But regardless, the buyer put the kibosh on the deal at the closing table because of the lead-based paint disclosure being provided not at the appropriate time. So the questions here are this. Both brokers have put their clients at risk in this scenario. And both brokers have opened the potential for litigation. Both of them have, both the listing broker and the buyer's broker. And both brokers may have been negligent in their responsibility to properly represent their client's interests. Let's look at that a bit. How did the buyer's broker put their client at risk? Did the buyer broker request the form prior to submitting an offer? Did they go that extra step and say, hey, wait a second, where's the form? We need it. And is it in the buyer's best interest for a buyer broker to submit an offer which is void due to the absence of the form? And by using this provision to get out of the contract, the buyer broker allowed the possibility of litigation and thereby potential extra cost, certainly aggravation, for their client. What about the listing broker? How did the listing broker put their client at risk? Well, by the listing broker not following proper procedures, the listing broker has put the entire transaction at risk, obviously. And because of that, they did not act in the best interests of their client. So the question is begged to be asked, what does a buyer's broker do if they can't get the listing broker participation, if they can't get the lead-based paint disclosure from the listing broker? They try, they get nothing. So ultimately, here's the best practice here. The buyer broker should send the listing broker notice by email or by certified mail that the disclosure hasn't been provided, and if they don't get it, they should repeat the request for disclosure, and of course, keeping a record of every email or every piece of mail that is sent. They need to request that disclosure and request it again. The buyer broker should print the notice, and then they should have the buyer client sign the notice, and then place the same notice that the buyer client has signed in the transaction file. This way, if they are audited for lead-based paint disclosure meeting the criteria for that, they can show that at least they did their job to the best of their ability. Okay? It's not the way it needs to be done, but at least they can show they tried. But see, here's the big problem with that. Ultimately, really, you should not have a buyer sign the disclosure before the seller signs the disclosure before the seller makes the disclosure, because ultimately the seller is supposed to make the lead-based paint disclosure. How can you have a buyer sign something that the seller hasn't disclosed? So it is sort of a catch-22. So here's our suggested approach. This is the best practice with regard to lead-based paint. The listing broker, obviously, should provide and sign and have the seller sign the lead-based paint disclosure and have that then made available to all buyers brokers prior to them making an offer. Now, the ability we have with modern multiple listing services is to actually upload that and have that right attached to the listing right now. Very, very convenient. But if that's not possible, have the lead-based paint disclosure in the house or something of that nature, but make it available so that it can be signed and done prior to the writing of an offer. And then once the offer is done, the lead-based paint disclosure is fully executed and sent to the seller along with any offer, but it is done ahead of the offer. We really need to be making sure we're doing this correctly and can document that it's being done correctly in our files, because the Environmental Protection Agency is paying attention to this. Fines have been levied against brokers and brokerage firms. And remember, it's the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act that requires this disclosure. And there have been a number of fines lately that have been levied. One in New York for $67,000. One in Kansas for about $9,600. Pennsylvania, a huge case there, $82,000 in fines with over 20 properties involved. A couple other in Massachusetts. And in Honolulu, there are fines being levied. There are people that are getting sort of the wrong end of the lead-based paint disclosure, and they're paying a price for that. Don't let that be you. Make sure you're doing it correctly.